Thank you for Innofader for sending these over. We got 2 Mini Innofader Plus S's, and inside we have some very important instructions. First of all, you're going to be changing a couple things on each fader. Simple jumpers, seems a lot more cumbersome than it really is, but you can get through it pretty easy. On the back side, we're going to have our calibration settings. That'll flip your inputs on your channels from your fade down will be max volume to fade up will be off. It'll orient it the correct way to where your ups will be max volume, your downs will be off with the volume. I have a couple extra tools that we're not going to need, but it does help expedite this process a little bit more seamlessly. So I can go ahead and take out my fader, and you'll see what I've already done to the fader to show you what we need to get to. We have a couple jumpers already. You want to make sure they match those because they're going to be horizontal facing the whole direction of the fader initially. And you can just solder those off, and I'll show you right now how we did it, but you want to solder those off and just make some jumpers across, either with some wire or you can just go straight with some solder. So get my soldering iron turned on. I'll go ahead and tackle this in a little bit. Right now, let's get this mixer disassembled. Start with the faders, these P-lock fader caps. We might not end up needing them because I got some alternatives. Last one. Be careful with these because they are very delicate. Don't break them. And now we got to fully disassemble this mixer and get to its board underneath. So I'm going to take off the 6 faceplate screws. So we have a couple more screws that we need to tackle. Some on the side, of course the opposite side, right on here. And then I believe 3 more with those little arrows in the front, or the inputs. They're a little bit bigger. We had a Phillips 1 for the smaller screws. These ones are a little bit larger, so we can get away with a drill. You don't have too many varied screws, but you do want to keep track of which ones go where. While you're unscrewing, it's all right to use a drill. Be careful though, because if you try to screw it back in with a drill, you can end up stripping what you're doing, and then that screw just becomes unusable. It might just fall out, and you have a weak point in the mixer. So we have a few screws here and there that aren't the exact same size, and you'll see right now, these top screws are gonna be a little bit shorter than the side screws. So you can see that you have the smaller length one goes for the top, where those arrows are. These longer screws, and although they're the same threading, they're meant for a specific spot. Be careful, make sure you hold on to everything so it doesn't fall out, so you can definitely break something. This is not a cheap mixer. I'm sure those of you that already have it know. You see my little yellow electrical tape pieces? That'll allow you to add in a little bit of extra cut-in distance from the walls, so that way you have the extra sharp cut that you might not be able to get with software. When you lift the board out of its housing, you want to be able to grab it from the tops right here. That'll give you a little bit more to just hold on to the sides. Be careful because you do have 2 cables you want to unplug. So you have, right here, a little ribbon cable that holds the board down. So take that out carefully by unclipping those little clips, and then grab it from the connector too. You don't want to rip out those cables themselves. These little silver screws are what hold the lower half of the mixer down too, right under your fader section. So you have some silver screws that go into these little side holes right here. I'll set that aside. We don't need the main body. This is all we're working on now. We have to remove 2 screws to get rid of this RF shield and the legs that attach to the body of the mixer. If you take a look, there's 2 screws attached to the FX paddles that you'll want to remove. You'll see these grounding wires that join the body of the board and these daughter boards. Before we get to disassembling all the screws, we just have 2 final screws on the very top, and then everything else should be numbered. These are your retention clips that hold the motherboard into the body itself. All right, now that we have the main board of the mixer just out in front of us, there's a couple things that we want to be able to address, because you'll see some of the mistakes I made. If you look closely, you can see right here, I had to make a jumper because I ripped off one of the solder pads. So before we get to the soldering portion, I just want to give you a word of warning. Be careful. You have ribbon cables and you have solder pads. So you want to be able to take out these ribbon cables from your effects pads. And you'll see on that one, my little retention clip is broken. One of the little nubs, if you're a little too hard on them, you'll break off the nub. Take off the other one, and you'll see how that one's staying in place. It's not moving underneath this little ribbon cable. Don't be like me. Don't go too ham. Again, different screws. Find a different spot for them. Organize them. Have a little magnetic board that you can kind of consolidate everything into one area. Thankfully, all these silver screws are pretty much similar. You'll see a couple black ones. We're not going to need those. We have a couple more ribbon cables too. It's another spot where you got to be careful. These are for our LEDs, specifically our 4x2 pads, our little hot cube pads, our rolls, save loops, all this stuff. These little pads right here are all being controlled by this little ribbon cable. Now that one doesn't have a number. We'll take it off just in case. These ones you can see we have black circles or non-white circles. Those ones you don't need. That's just for your little OLED screen that allow you to change a couple things like your Bluetooth settings and whatnot. But the little tab, little plastic clear tab right below it, we are going to need to remove. Everyone that has a little white ring with a number next to it, for sure we need to take out. There's a couple more that look like they don't have a number next to it, but they do have a white ring. We'll take those out too, just to be safe. So it seems like we have all the screws taken off, but we can't take off the PCB just yet. It's got a little bit of resistance to it. One, this cable has its own hidden screw that we need to remove. So let's fold this little metal tab out the way. We see number 31. That's hidden away. We'll hide this away with the rest of our screws. Keep it in a safe spot. Flip it back over. We see a couple of hex rings. So one right here for the sampler, one for the headphone volume, and one for the Q master blend knob. Thankfully there's only 3, so might work. And then once those are off, you can actually separate. There we go. So we have O-rings that we need to keep, washers I should say, that we need to keep an eye on, and our 3 nuts. So last 2 screws we have are these top black screws hidden at the top by your inputs and outputs of your mixer. Same deal. So now if you let it go, you can see that it separates from the board pretty nicely. We don't need any of this plastic. Set that aside again. PCB time. Now that we turn it over, we can see our OLED screen, all of our buttons and whatnot, LEDs for our pads, and then most importantly, our line faders. So right now, you can see that they're pretty tall for being regular line faders, just like the new Innofaders that we're gonna throw in. So we see we got a tall stem, oriented like that. Bam. So let's turn the mixer back over. Make sure you have all your tools ready though. Soldering iron, solder itself, solder socket to remove all the old solder off the old fader. Start heating up some of these pads and remove our old faders. If you have to, add a little bit more solder, just so that way it makes everything flow a little more nicely. Heat it up, take it off, and bam, clean the solder pad. That should be good. All right, now that we have most of the solder off of our pads, you still might have a little bit attaching the pins to the pads itself. So what you can still do though is heat it up, pull it out a little bit gently. Don't pull too hard, just enough to be able to put some tension on it while the pad's heating up, and that way you can hear it dislodge. Be careful when you're soldering on this board, because you can see right next to our pad there's a couple little components that we could accidentally knock off. So just be cautious with what you're doing and what you're heating up. Bam, we have all three of them out, all three pins. So we'll set those aside, and now let's take a look at our new Innofaders. So now we're looking at the body of the Innofader itself. We'll take a look at the instructions and see exactly what configuration we need to switch everything to. It comes stock with configuration 1 where the jumpers are positioned a certain way. We have to adjust it to configuration 4 where everything is perpendicular to the body of the fader. You can see these jumpers right here. They're going to be perpendicular to the pins in particular. So right now you can see I've already done this mod, but it's very simple. So right now we're changing the jumpers on the faders to be able to have the circuits aligned properly on the mixer, so we're not blowing anything on the actual board itself. A jumper is just something that simply bridges two connection points. So these have 0 value, so we can get away with just some solder, a simple wire. We don't need any specific value, any particular component for it. Just a little bit of solder to jumper the two, to bridge the two connection points. You can see there's like a little 4 square right here that allows you to figure out which orientation you're going to need your jumpers. There we go. So we have bridge connection at the top, bridge connection at the bottom. See those little circle pads on the side? That's more of just a test point for the factory to go ahead and check everything's correct. Now you'll just want to do the exact same process for both of these faders, so you'll have bridge connections on both of them. You can see that we've already done it to the second one. So once we have everything kind of bent out of place, jumpered in the correct way, you can go ahead and flip these over and start assembling it back into the mixer itself. And if you have enough space in those little holes, you might be able to just through-hole this back into where the other faders were. If not, you might need to heat up the pads as well on the way in as you did coming out. For me, I was able to easily slide these into place, but just like we were removing them, if you have to heat up the pads a little bit, it's fine. We're bending these pins out of the way that correspond with these matching holes, the ones that have empty pins. You want to bend those exact same ones out of the way on the Innofader. So now that we have one in, we can see that our Innofader sticker is going to be on the right side facing our channel 2 on both of them, and then our calibration button you can bend and fold out the way, so that way it's facing upwards towards the sky, and that way once you have everything reassembled you can still go ahead and hit the calibration button. Same thing on the other one. We'll see if we can just push this through, otherwise I might need to heat up a little bit. Let's get the soldering iron back together. There we go. So let's heat this up a little bit, loosen up the pads. You know what? We can actually put a little bit of solder on it. If we're lucky, it might even fall into place. Just with a little bit of pressure. You can hear it trying to make its way through. Bam. Same thing on this one. Try to heat it up, loosen up that solder that's in there. We can already see it's starting to come up through the holes. All right, once they're through, we'll go ahead and solder them back into place. Add a little bit more when necessary. Bam. This one. So before we really screw everything down, we want to take a look at the other side. So right now, we have no way to do the calibrate button. So we want to make a little marker that'll allow us to go ahead and hit that calibrate button that's on the other side of our plastic. So flip it back over. This is an optional step, but it's going to make our little calibration a lot easier. So what the calibration button does is allow us to adjust settings on the Innofader, because it's going to come in a working state, but it's going to be inverted. So down is up, up is down. You want to be able to flip that to where your volume moves up when you lift the fader up and goes off when you move the fader down. So we'll flip this mixer over, take a look. There's no way currently to hit our calibrate buttons that are just to the right of our body of the fader itself. So let's flip it back over, take off the PCB. One more time, take a look, and we have actually a pretty good spot that we can use to drill in our holes. So what I'm gonna do is take my drill, and be careful. Drills will slip, so hold everything steady. Bam. So let's do a test fit, see if we need to make an adjustment, make a bigger hole if we need to. We'll put this back, see where our calibration button is, and see if we can actually get like a little pinhole in there. Start taking a look. Let's see. Yeah, I think we can. So what we'll do, make one more hole, and then what we'll do after this is we'll hot glue our faders down, and then we'll also hot glue our button down. So let's do one more test fit, make sure the faders are in a good position. We're gonna go ahead and make sure the body of the fader is hot glued down, so that way, you know how people will say that these faders break? It's just because they end up ripping them off. So to keep it down on the board a little bit more securely, put hot glue around the entire perimeter. And then we'll also hot glue this calibrate button down to make sure that doesn't go anywhere and it stays within view of our new little pinhole. All right, now we'll go ahead and hot glue the perimeter of our faders. Same thing as before, there's components nearby on your right channel. Your left channel, you're a little more free to hot glue as you please. But you want to be careful with all the little components that are surrounding your fader. And leave a little bit of a space around your fader calibrate button, so that way you can glue it down by itself. So put a little dollop of glue. It'll help if you have a little screwdriver that can keep the heat away from your finger. We'll hold the calibrate button down with our screwdriver to make sure there's no heat on your finger. Otherwise, it will hurt. You touch it. It's not gonna burn you, but it's gonna be real hot. We'll do a test fit, make sure the button's visible through our through holes. There we go. You can see we have our calibrate. It's not positioned perfectly, but you're not gonna need it all the time. So we'll do the same thing for channel 2. Just a little dollop of glue everywhere you think you need it. Right above the button enough to clear it and give us a little spot to glue it down itself. And after we go ahead and put that down, we'll hold down this button in place for about 30 seconds on top of this glue. And once that's all solid, we'll go ahead and be able to actuate it without any issues and without it bouncing around either. One more fit check, see how everything goes after you clean up your glue strands. Final check to make sure everything's in place and how we want it. So let's take a look at that button. From what I can see, looks to be in perfect position. So before you fully assemble it, you want to be able to fish these ribbon cables back through. Don't plug them in yet, just make sure they're on top of the board. There we go. So now we can go ahead and start putting all the screws back in. You want to make sure both of these cables come out through these holes on the PCB, otherwise you're going to be fishing for them. You can end up breaking them if they're caught on the back side of the board. This is where it's going to pay off if you've been separating your screws as you've been disassembling it. Now you can go ahead and easily find out which screws go where and reassemble everything back together, because now you have everything sectioned out by PCB screws, chassis screws, and faceplate screws. So I have these smaller silver screws for what get connected onto the PCB. I have these two black screws that go onto the upper lip of my mixer underneath my PCB. These two larger screws that'll put back together when I'm reassembling the body of my mixer, and then my larger black screws as well for the outer section of my mixer. These tiny machine screws, that'll just be for your faceplate. There's no particular order when you're reassembling your screws, but these numbers do help you go in a nice kind of evenly distributed pressure pattern while you're reassembling it. It's not required, but it is there if you want to do the safe route. All I'm using is finger tight pressure. I'm not even wrenching it down to where it's going to be locked in place. I just want to make sure I can feel the board touch the screw, then I'm done. So now we'll reconnect our ribbon cables. We have 2 for the effects paddles, 2 for the cue buttons. You won't be able to see exactly where your stopping point is on this ribbon cable, but you'll be able to feel where there's a bit of a resistance. After you hold the tension clip open, you'll be able to push in that ribbon cable ever so gently to be able to lock it in place after you find that end point. If you look closer, you can still see a bit of the contact points protruding out of the connector, but that's fine. You don't need to stuff it in all the way, just enough to where you feel that wall that you hit as you're inserting the ribbon cable. Same thing on the one for the cue points. Now that all the screws on the PCB are reinserted, we'll go ahead and get this RF shield and throw it back onto the top of the mixer along with its wing clips that hold the PCB to the chassis. Line it up, you can see the 2 little tabs at the top that show you where on the PCB and what orientation our cover goes. Now that everything's connected, you can see our cutouts on the shield match up with the cutouts on the PCB to show you which way to orient our shield. And you'll also want to reattach our chassis clips that hold the PCB into the chassis. So now that we have the PCB reassembled, we'll go ahead and bring our chassis over, put it all back together. Get our 2 connectors reattached. So you might have a little trouble trying to get it connected with one hand because you want to be able to hold the clip open and fish the cable in itself, but once you get it reattached, you can go ahead and close the clip. As long as it looks good, you can go ahead and close up our mixer. Cool. Now that we have it reassembled, let's go ahead and give a quick power test, make sure everything lights up before we finalize our assembly. We can see we have a couple lights lighting up, LEDs glowing, everything's happy. We're going to test the audio, make sure the channel faders are responding correctly. If your guys' are inverted, go ahead and follow the instructions on Innofader's sheet and invert your channels. Next, we'll start with some audio, plug in our iPad with some beats so we can test the line functionality of our mixer. So now that we have our audio in, we can see it's lighting up on channel 1. If we bring up the master volume, we can see that we have some lights. So that means we're getting audio into our master channel. And if I drop the fader, you should see that also goes away. If you guys find that your channel is inverted, go ahead and use the instructions to invert your channel. And you can see all the cut calibrations you're going to need to be able to orient your fader correctly. So next, do the same thing on channel 2. Simple process, turn up our gains, make sure we have an audio. And if we drop the fader, same thing, you see our master goes away. So that means we have a successfully working Innofader. Good news. So I went ahead and powered down the mixer. We'll go ahead and disconnect the actual power and I'll assemble the final screws. We just have a few more to go before we go ahead and close this baby up. A little hack, if you want, you can go ahead and make any non-magnetic screwdriver a magnetic screwdriver temporarily by rubbing a magnet in a singular direction. And now you can see that screw sticks to my screwdriver. Easier in case you keep getting it lost underneath the internals. Remember what I said, how we have two different types of screws at the outside. We have the short ones and the long ones. The long ones, you have 6 for the sides, and you have 3 short ones for the top by your inputs and outputs. So there we go. We have all our screws put back into our mixer. All we have left is our cover plate. But if you want to do any calibration, now's the chance. If you made those little holes, it's the perfect opportunity to take advantage of them. Now we have a couple final washers and nuts that we want to put together on our sample level and our headphone level. Doesn't have to be too tight, finger tight is all that it really needs, but if you have those needle nose pliers or that socket wrench we talked about earlier, you can still use it. But just like the rest of these screws, don't go too heavy on them. Now if you organize your screws correctly, you won't see anything left in your screw holder. Only problem now is your original fader stems are a little bit different heights, so your P-lock clips won't work. But thankfully Innofader gives us a couple replacement caps. I went and took the extra route, so I have a couple cooler caps that I wanted to use just to customize it a little bit further. As you can see, I went with a 909 style theme, a little older classic design, and yet I wanted to go with some black and white fader caps to finish it off. Now that everything's assembled and screwed back together, all you have left to do is put on your fader caps and your fader knobs, and bam, you're done. Thank you guys for tuning in for the first video in our Scratch Break Tech series. We got many more mods and gear reviews to come. I'm Straps. Hit me up in the Instagram link down below or in the comments below, and we can go ahead and answer any more questions you might have for us. Keep scratching. Peace.
You good?
Yeah, I'm good. You can see that we have a couple holes for where the...
We'll skip that.
Should we cut this off card?
Yeah, if you guys have to. It's gonna take me a second to just put everything back together.
I mean, how
Run
much?
them out.
22%?
Have 13 minutes.